Okay, with Wicked hitting the big screen, I think it's the perfect time to look back at the story that started it all, The Wizard of Oz, and talk about its role in how society began to view witches differently. So this story was written in the early 1900s by Frank L. Baum. And this story didn't just give us an iconic fantasy world, right? It also planted the seeds for shifting how witches were portrayed in pop culture. By introducing a good witch, Baum not only challenged harmful stereotypes, but also opened the door for more scholarly texts to re-examine witchcraft's historical role and cultural significance. To understand why this mattered, you have to consider how witches were seen before Baum's time. For centuries, witches were demonized, persecuted, and prosecuted by institutions like the church. They were labeled as devil worshippers and blamed for natural disasters and for crimes they didn't commit, all to justify their torture and execution. These weren't villains from a storybook. They were real people, often healers, midwives, and independent women who didn't conform to patriarchal expectations. Their suffering was systematic, brutal, and devastating. In media and propaganda, witches were often depicted as hideous, deformed, and malevolent figures, reinforcing fear and disgust to justify their persecution and vilification. And then, with The Wizard of Oz, Baum did something groundbreaking, because he introduced the idea of a good witch. Glinda wasn't feared or hated. She floated in on her pink bubble and was revered. She was kind, wise, and powerful, and she wasn't working for the devil. This was a major narrative shift. For the first time in Western storytelling, witches weren't automatically cast as evil hags or dangerous threats. Baum opened the door to the idea that witches could be complex, even good. Many people believe that Baum was deeply influenced by his mother, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was a central figure in the women's suffrage movement. Gage wasn't just fighting for the right to vote. She was pushing for a complete overhaul of how women were treated in society. She wrote extensively about the connection between the persecution of witches and the oppression of women, arguing that both were rooted in patriarchal fear of female power and independence. Still, it's important to acknowledge the limitations in Baum's narrative. While Galinda represented a step forward, the story reinforced a rigid binary. Witches could either be good or evil. There was no space for nuance. And the traits that made Galinda good aligned with society's expectations of a more palatable mold of acceptable femininity. Beauty, kindness, selflessness. Meanwhile, the Wicked Witch of the West is believed to reflect society's fear of strong and independent women, for she was punished for being bold, assertive, and unapologetically determined to get back what belonged to her. But despite its shortcomings, The Wizard of Oz marked a turning point. It challenged centuries of conditioning and showed that witches didn't have to be symbols of fear and evil. It gave us a starting point, a way to reimagine witches as something more than just scapegoats or monsters. Without Baum's work, we might not have ever seen the more empowered and complex portrayals of witches we have today, like Sabrina, the Sanderson sisters, or Elphaba herself.